Hello, and welcome to the Argus Fertilizer Matters podcast. My name is Nykole King, and I'm a market reporter on the NPK and Potash markets based in London. Today, our topic is the decision of the Ethiopian Agricultural Business Corporation, or EABC for short, to issue a tender for DAP instead of NPS this year. This surprised the market in late August when it launched its 9th September tender. We're going to discuss what was the impetus for the change and what this means for the tender and the market moving forward. To talk about this, I'm joined with David Maher, Global Editor of the NPK Report. Welcome, David.
Thanks very much, Nykole.
So, David, under its 2023 tender, the EABC requested just over 1 million tons of NPSB and 330,000 tons of NPS, as well as nearly 1 million tons of urea. This is one of the largest annual complex fertilizer tenders issued to the market. David, can you tell us why the sudden change in fertilizer types?
Yes, that's the key first question on this whole thing. What we have to remember before anything else, and anybody who's listened to this who may not be familiar with the situation, Ethiopia was formerly a DAP market as well as urea, but on the phosphate side, it was up until 2016 a DAP market for 40 years or more. Urea and DAP are the only fertilizers used on a commercial level in Ethiopian agriculture. So as I mentioned, 2016, there was a switch from DAP, diammonium phosphate, to complex grades. And that was thanks largely to soil surveys that were carried out in the country, which helped to convince the government, the authorities, that the DAP that they'd been using for all that time was not as efficient or wise a choice as NPS would be, as specific grades that we'll get into a little later. Now, the question of why the change now back to DAP? So we're still very much in the early stages in Argus editorial of understanding exactly why this took place. And certain talks would have been undertaking. Some of that information will probably forever remain inaccessible, but nevertheless, we will get a broad understanding of that as time goes on, and then hopefully, as time further passes, a more and more specific and detailed understanding of it. But one clear factor that outweighs all else is that seeking DAP should continue to ensure a more competitive process than was the case in recent years since 2016, when it was essentially a foregone conclusion.
And how does this change affect the typical dynamics of the tender with suppliers?
Well, in both cases, the NPS tenders of recent years and what appears to be just DAP this year, they were both, technically speaking, open for competition. So these are open tenders. Various parties can get involved, bid, compete with one another, and so on. In reality, that wasn't the case since 2016 with the NPS and NPSB, technically, that the EABC tendered for. That's for logistical reasons, output capabilities, and so on, essentially meaning that the full 1 million ton plus quantity of NPS and NPSB was going to be awarded to OCP, the giant Moroccan fertilizer producer. So generally a more competitive process should suit the buyer. So this would explain the basic reason for the change in the terms of costs and other factors. In theory, there would be multiple bidders, putting the receiver in a stronger position with regard to its demands. What's suitable for it, what's convenient for it, when the delivery period works, and so on. It puts the onus to meet its needs right at the doorstep of the suppliers, more so than the onus being on the buyer to sort out the details and negotiate. However, as it has turned out, so far, I must underline that has not been the case. The EABC up to now has only sought 360,000 tons of DAP, which according to all previous tenders does not cover its needs or anywhere close. And it received just one offer. And that was only for 60,000 tons, and it was from a single source. So it hasn't worked out so far in the sense that this, in theory, should have been a proper open process like you would see in large fertilizer tenders, like urea, for example, elsewhere in the world, and Ethiopia. What was interesting was just that there was just that one offer from Saudi Arabia, which does have a geographical advantage over other potential suppliers to the EABC and Ethiopia in general, but it's still a surprise, or it was a surprise, that nobody else tried to get involved. And there may be something more to that we'll find out in the coming days, weeks, and possibly even months. What's also interesting is that this initial tender, the 360,000 tonnes, as mentioned, was open only to producers, not traders. For example, no traders involved, just producers directly to EABC. So to round up an answer to the question, it should have changed it entirely. It should have been a very open process instead of a near foregone conclusion when it was OCP supplying the NPS. However, as of now, that hasn't been the case.
And do we have a clear idea of how much DAP the EABC is planning to request across all of its tenders this year?
We have a good idea, but we don't have a clear, definitive number. And I would say the reason for that is because nobody does, including the EABC itself. We believe it to be possibly around 1.2, 1.3 million tonnes for delivery across 2024 to 25. And we also understand that the EABC will not tender for any NPS, NPSB. So that would be all DAP, 1.2, 1.3 million tonnes. But as I said, nobody will truly know until it all plays out. As I said, it's quite a strong possibility that the EABC itself does not yet know. It's still a possibility the EABC could still return to seek NPS at some point. It may ultimately be a mix of DAP and NPS and NPSB that it seeks. It could be even more complicated than that. We will need to wait and see. The reality that OCP did not offer into the DAP 360,000 tonnes tender that EABC has so far issued may be a message to EABC, to the Ethiopian authorities, that the switch was not a great idea. It's not something that is ultimately going to work out well from the buy side, and the message may ultimately be heard. We could see a mix of DAP and NPS, NPSB. I must stress that all of our information, which is quite an extensive amount of investigation so far, suggests that it is going to be all DAP. But I, for one, certainly wouldn't be convinced of that yet.
Okay, and as we were talking about earlier, this is a massive tender for the market. So what repercussions does this have on the wider market and prices?
What's interesting about this situation is that on the face of it, as you say, on the face of it, right, this should be a bearish situation for the market. I'm talking about the NPS and wider market for complex fertilizers, NPKs and so on. I'm not speaking about the DAP market when I'm talking here. It should be a bearish situation because there's a whole load of demand suddenly disappeared from the market and shifted to another product. That, unfortunately, would be too simple of an explanation. The main reason for that is that the supply just won't be there. It's not that the 1.3 million tonnes of NPS and NPSB, specifically grades 1938-0 plus 7S, or in and around that, are going to suddenly flood out into the global market, with sellers, OCP specifically, looking to sell this and put it into various different markets and needing to find buyers for all of the supply. Because it just will not make those quantities or anything like those quantities. So in that sense, it doesn't affect the supply demand balance in the wider market. Not in the way that it would in another market, like if somebody had produced 2 million tons of MOP, expecting it to go into a big, into one of the big contracts in China or India, and then suddenly China or India didn't want these quantities, and there's 2 million tons or more of standard MOP floating around the global market that needs to be sold. It's not a situation like that. The product just won't be there. So in that sense, in itself, it won't have a significant impact on the supply demand balance. And in turn, it shouldn't have a significant impact on price direction or price changes. Other factors will cause those changes, as they would at any other time of the year or in any other market. The EABC situation itself, even if it does ultimately take purely DAP, no NPS, it should not in itself affect the global market for complex fertilizers, as I say, in terms of bearishness, bullishness, or anything aside.
Okay, but it looks like we'll still have to wait and see how this plays out on the DAP side of the market. And Argus will, of course, continue to cover this as closely as it develops, both on the complex fertilizer side and the phosphate side. David, I want to thank you so much for your time today. We have run out of time for this podcast, but thank you so much for joining us and sharing some insights into this fascinating market development.
Thanks very much, Nykole, and thanks to everybody for listening. I hope it was of use and interest. Thanks a lot.
Of course, and don't forget to tune into the next episode of Argus Fertilizer Matters podcast that will discuss the key takeaways of the TFI conference and the Chilean sulfuric acid benchmark negotiations. Thank you so much for listening.